On our anniversary, my husband threw away my handmade gift and said he wanted something real. Our daughter laughed and said, "You can't beat Dad's new wife." I didn't argue. I just picked it out of the trash. A few weeks later, he saw it on display, with a $170,000 price tag. "That's from Hazel. Dad's friend from work bought it for me because she felt bad about my clothes." My 16-year-old daughter Amelia stood in her bedroom doorway, wearing a designer jacket worth more than our monthly groceries, delivering this information like she was telling me about the weather. I set down the ceramic vase I'd been carrying, 3 months of secret pottery work, covered in hand-painted chrysanthemums for Dylan's anniversary gift tomorrow, and felt something crack inside me that had nothing to do with clay. Hazel. A woman's name I'd never heard before, buying my daughter expensive clothes, and Amelia saying it like I should already know who she was. My fingers, still stained cobalt blue from the glazing work, trembled as I reached for the jacket's price tag, still attached inside the collar. $800. For a jacket. From Dad's friend. She owns a gallery, Amelia continued, turning to examine herself in the hallway mirror. On 5th Avenue. She said she remembers what it's like being young and wanting to fit in. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, made my chest tighten. I watched my daughter smooth down the Italian leather, watched her face light up in a way it never did when I brought home fabric to make her something special. Last month I'd spent 2 weeks sewing her a dress for the school dance, hand-embroidering tiny flowers along the hem. She'd worn it once, then hidden it in the back of her closet behind the clothes Dylan bought her. "How long has Dad been friends with this Hazel?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my mind was racing through every late night Dylan had worked, every weekend meeting, every time he'd come home smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. "I don't know. A while." Amelia shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation. "She's cool though. She knows about art and stuff. Real art. Real art." The words stung more than they should have. I glanced down at the vase in my hands, at the chrysanthemums I'd painted so carefully that my eyes would blur from the detail work. Each petal contained at least 12 different color gradations, a technique I'd developed myself after 6 failed attempts. The pottery teacher at the community center had called it revolutionary. But apparently it wasn't real art. I made my way to our tiny kitchen, setting the vase carefully on the counter where I'd been putting the final touches on the glaze. The morning light from our single good window caught the surface, making the flowers seem to breathe. Tomorrow was our anniversary. 12 years. I'd started working on this piece 3 months ago, sneaking off to the community studio whenever Dylan worked late, which was increasingly often. The apartment felt smaller than usual as I moved through our morning routine. Dylan emerged from the bedroom at exactly 7:15, his pattern as predictable as the subway schedule. Dark suit, blue tie, the same cologne he'd worn since law school. He scrolled through his phone while I made his coffee, 2 sugars, splash of cream in the mug his mother had given us as a wedding gift. "Don't wait up tonight," he said without looking up from his screen. Big case. The Henderson merger. I'd heard about the Henderson merger for 3 months now. It required a lot of late nights apparently. A lot of weekend meetings. A lot of times when he'd come home after midnight and slide into bed, careful not to touch me, reeking of wine and someone else's perfume. "Tomorrow's our anniversary," I said quietly, watching his face for any sign of recognition. His fingers paused on his phone for just a moment. "Right. We should do something. We should do something." 12 years of marriage reduced to an obligation, a checkbox on his calendar probably marked by his secretary. I wanted to tell him about the vase, about the months of work, about how I'd developed a new glazing technique just to capture the way morning light looked on chrysanthemums. Instead, I just nodded and poured his coffee. At the community center that afternoon, I tried to focus on teaching my pottery class to the group of seniors who came twice a week. My student Margaret, 73 years old with hands that shook unless she was working with clay, noticed the distraction immediately. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You keep staring at nothing." I showed her a photo of the vase on my phone, needing someone to see it to confirm it existed, that it mattered. She studied the image for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "The color work is extraordinary. What's the occasion?" "Anniversary gift. For my husband." Margaret's hands stilled on her clay. "My husband threw away everything I ever made for him. Said it was cluttering up the house. 20 years of needlework, pottery, paintings. All of it in the garbage. She looked up at me and her eyes held a warning. 6 months after he died, the Metropolitan Museum called. They'd seen one of my pieces at an estate sale, wanted to acquire my entire collection. $2 million they paid his second wife for work he'd called worthless. The room felt cold suddenly, despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "I'm sorry," I said, not knowing what else to offer. "Don't be sorry. Be smart." She returned to her clay, her movements deliberate and precise. "That vase of yours, it's professional quality. Museum quality even. But if your husband is anything like mine was, he won't see it. Men like that, they only see value when someone else tells them it's there." That evening I sat alone at our small dining table, adding the final layer of sealant to the vase. The apartment was quiet except for the neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls. Amelia was in her room, probably on the phone with friends, trying on that expensive jacket again. Dylan was at his meeting or with Hazel or wherever he went when he said he was working late. I thought about Margaret's words as I worked, about value and recognition, about the difference between what something was worth and what someone thought it was worth. The vase was perfect now, every line and curve exactly as I'd envisioned. Tomorrow I would give it to Dylan and maybe, just maybe, he would see what I'd poured into it. Maybe he would understand that this was more than just a gift. It was proof that I was more than just someone who made his coffee and kept his house and raised his daughter while he built his career. But even as I told myself this story, I knew better. The evidence was there in Amelia's $800 jacket, in Dylan's late nights, in the way he looked through me rather than at me. Tomorrow would be our anniversary and I would give him this vase that contained 3 months of my life, and he would set it aside the way he set aside everything I made, everything I was. The cobalt blue under my fingernails caught the light as I lifted the vase one final time, checking for imperfections that didn't exist. Tomorrow would be different, I told myself. Tomorrow had to be different. The morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. I woke early, my hands steady as I prepared everything for tonight's dinner. The vase sat on the counter, finally complete, its chrysanthemums catching the pale morning light in a way that made my breath catch. 12 years deserved something special, something that showed I still believed in us despite the growing distance, despite the late nights, despite Hazel's name hanging unspoken in the air between us. By 5 o'clock, I had transformed our cramped dining area into something almost magical. The dollar store candles looked elegant in the dimness, their flames reflecting off the good plates I'd saved from my mother's estate. The chicken marsala filled the apartment with the scent of wine and mushrooms, though I'd burned my wrist twice on our temperamental oven that ran 50 degrees hotter than the dial claimed. The mark would blister, but I didn't care. I wrapped the vase in tissue paper I'd spent an hour hand-painting with tiny gold hearts, each one a small declaration of hope. 6 o'clock passed. Then 6:30. I texted Dylan once, a simple reminder about dinner. The message showed as read, but no response came. The marsala began to congeal in its pan. The candles dripped wax onto the tablecloth. At 6:40 I heard his key in the lock. Dylan entered looking like he'd been somewhere that required close contact. His usually pristine suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, and the smell that preceded him into our home wasn't his cologne. It was something floral and expensive, something that clung to his jacket like an accusation. "Traffic was horrible," he said, not meeting my eyes as he surveyed the table with the expression of someone discovering an ambush. "You didn't have to do all this." The dismissal in his voice made my chest tighten, but I pushed forward, gesturing to his chair. "It's our anniversary. 12 years. He sat reluctantly, checking his phone twice before I even had the chance to serve the food. I watched him eat mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere, probably with whoever owned that perfume. When I placed the wrapped gift in front of him, he stared at it like it might explode. "Open it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His fingers worked at the paper without enthusiasm, tearing through the hearts I'd painted so carefully. When the vase emerged, when the candlelight hit those chrysanthemums and made them glow like they were alive, I held my breath waiting for his reaction. His face shifted from mild curiosity to something worse than anger. Disappointment mixed with embarrassment, the look you give a child who's presented you with a macaroni necklace when you're too old to pretend it's jewelry. "Stella." He set the vase down carefully, too carefully, like it might contaminate him. "We talked about this. About gifts. You said you wanted something real, I started, but he was already shaking his head. This isn't what I meant. He pulled out his phone, swiping to a photo. Look, this is what Hazel gave me. A Rolex Submariner. $18,000. That's a real gift. The room tilted. Hazel. He'd said her name like I should understand, like this was normal, like receiving $18,000 watches from another woman was something that happened in marriages. Who is Hazel? My voice sounded strange, disconnected from my body. Dylan looked at me with genuine surprise, as if I'd asked who the president was. I told you about her. My paralegal. He paused, scrolling through his phone again. Well, more than that now. We got married 6 months ago. Small ceremony at the courthouse. I'm sure I mentioned it. The words didn't make sense. They were English, arranged in a grammatical structure I understood, but their meaning refused to process. Married. 6 months ago. While we were still married, while I was sleeping beside him, while I was making his coffee every morning with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. We're married, I said stupidly. Technically yes. The divorce papers are delayed. Some filing error. He shrugged like we were discussing a parking ticket. But Hazel understands me, Stella. He gets what I need. She owns the Morrison Gallery on 5th Avenue. She appreciates success, ambition. She doesn't think a partnership is about homemade crafts and dinner at home. That's when Amelia walked in wearing the designer jacket, her timing so perfect it felt rehearsed. She glanced at the table, at the cooling food and dying candles, at the vase sitting abandoned by her father's plate, and she laughed. Not a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable one, but genuine amusement, the kind that bubbled up from real joy. Oh my God, Mom. You actually gave it to him. She picked up the vase, examining it like a curious artifact from an ancient civilization. This is so embarrassing. You can't compete with Dad's new wife. She owns an actual gallery. She knows what real art looks like. The betrayal from Dylan was expected somehow, a wound I'd been preparing for without admitting it. But Amelia's words, her casual cruelty, her easy dismissal of my work and my worth, that cut deeper than anything Dylan could have done. My daughter, who I'd taught to mix paint at age 3, who'd sat beside me at the pottery wheel just 2 years ago, had chosen her side without ever telling me there was a choice to make. When did you meet her? I asked Amelia, my voice surprisingly steady. Like months ago. She's been taking me shopping, helping me understand fashion and art and stuff that matters. She says I have potential, that I just need the right guidance. Amelia set the vase down with a careless thunk. She's teaching me about the real world, not this hobby stuff you do. Dylan stood abruptly, grabbing the vase with one hand like it was a piece of trash that needed immediate disposal. He walked to the kitchen and I heard the foot pedal of our garbage can, then the devastating thud of 3 months' work hitting the plastic liner. The sound echoed in the small apartment, final and absolute. I need something real in my life, Stella, he said, returning to grab his jacket. Hazel and I have a gallery opening tonight. Important collectors will be there. People who understand value. I'm going too, Amelia announced, already heading for the door. Hazel promised to introduce me to real artists. They left together, father and daughter, their footsteps synchronized in the hallway like they'd been practicing this exit. The apartment door closed with a decisive click, leaving me alone with the remnants of an anniversary dinner no one wanted. The candles continued their futile flickering, wax pooling on the tablecloth I'd inherited from my grandmother. The food sat untouched, growing cold like the marriage I'd been trying to save. I stood frozen in our kitchen, staring at the garbage can that held my gift. Through the thin walls, I could hear our neighbor's television playing a game show where people won money for answering questions correctly. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been answering the wrong questions for 12 years, trying to solve a puzzle that had already been completed without me. The apartment felt larger, suddenly emptier, like Dylan and Amelia had taken something essential with them when they left. Not love, that had departed long ago. They'd taken my delusions, my careful pretense that we were still a family, that my efforts mattered, that handmade gifts could compete with Rolex watches and gallery connections. I remained standing there, still in the dress I'd chosen carefully for tonight, still wearing the lipstick Dylan hadn't noticed, still believing somewhere deep down that tomorrow might be different. The candles finally guttered out, leaving me in darkness punctuated only by the city lights filtering through our single good window. Somewhere across town, my husband and daughter were entering a gallery with his new wife, surrounded by real art, leaving me here with the trash. The silence in the apartment pressed against my eardrums like water pressure at depth. I stood there for another 10 minutes, maybe 15, unable to move or think beyond the sound of that thud echoing in my mind. Finally, something primitive kicked in. Not quite rage, not quite determination, but a survival instinct that propelled me toward the kitchen sink. The yellow latex gloves from under the sink felt like armor as I snapped them on. I approached the trash can with the careful reverence of an archaeologist approaching a dig site. Inside, my vase sat atop coffee grounds and yesterday's takeout containers, a streak of orange Thai sauce painting one side like a wound. My hands shook as I lifted it out, cradling it against my chest despite the debris clinging to its surface. At the sink, I worked with the patience of a conservator restoring a masterpiece. Each paper towel dabbed away the indignity of garbage, revealing the chrysanthemums beneath still vibrant, still perfect, still defiant. As I cleaned, my grandmother's voice surfaced from somewhere deep in memory. She'd been standing at her own kitchen sink, washing dishes after another family dinner where my grandfather had dismissed her painting as a waste of time. "The world only sees what you show them, dear," she'd said, her Hungarian accent thick with conviction. "Show them garbage, they'll treat you like garbage. Show them gold and watch them scramble." I wrapped the vase in bubble wrap from the moving supplies we'd never thrown away, each layer of protection feeling like a small act of rebellion. Then I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. The screen's glow, the only light in the apartment besides the city bleeding through our window. Eleanor Morrison's name appeared in article after article. The 70-year-old gallery owner had discovered at least a dozen artists who'd gone from unknown to selling pieces for 6 figures. Every interview contained the same themes: authenticity over pedigree, emotion over technique, story over surface. In a Times piece from last year she'd said, "The best art comes from genuine pain transformed into beauty." I can spot inauthentic work from across the room, but true emotional resonance? That stops me in my tracks. I read until my eyes burned, until the city quieted to its 3 a.m. whisper, until I knew every exhibition she'd curated, every artist she'd launched, every quote she'd given about finding truth in unexpected places. By the time birds started their pre-dawn chorus, I'd memorized her gallery hours, her assistant's name, even the coffee shop next door where she reportedly spent mornings reviewing submissions. Sleep felt impossible, so I stood in front of the bathroom mirror practicing my pitch. The woman staring back looked like a ghost of myself, hollow-eyed, pale, hair limp from the night's humidity. But something in those eyes had changed. The deadness I'd grown accustomed to seeing had been replaced by something sharper, hungrier. "Mrs. Morrison," I practiced, my voice hoarse from disuse. "My name is Stella Brennan. I have a piece that was literally thrown in the trash by someone who couldn't recognize its value. But I think you might see what he couldn't. Too desperate. Too bitter. Mrs. Morrison, I'm an artist whose work explores themes of dismissal and worth. Too pretentious. Mrs. Morrison, my husband threw this in the garbage because it wasn't real enough. I'd like to know what you think. Direct. Honest. The kind of story that might intrigue someone who'd built a career on finding overlooked talent." At 8 a.m. I called the library where I worked part-time, my voice carefully constructed to sound congested. My supervisor, Janet, barely listened to my excuse before granting the sick day. After 3 years of perfect attendance, I'd earned the benefit of doubt. The lie came easily, surprisingly so for someone who'd spent 12 years telling the truth to someone who'd been lying the entire time. The subway ride to the Upper East Side felt like crossing into another country. My fellow passengers transformed from tired workers in sensible shoes to women in designer workout clothes heading to boutique fitness studios. By the time I emerged at 77th Street, my worn coat felt like a neon sign advertising my displacement. Morrison Gallery occupied a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned art viewing into performance. Even from across the street I could see the current display, massive abstract paintings that seemed to vibrate with color and movement. The security guard at the entrance wore a suit nicer than anything in Dylan's closet. His eyes tracked me from the moment I approached, taking in my coat with its pilled fabric, my scuffed boots, my tote bag that had seen better decades. I walked past him without acknowledging his stare, my chin lifted in a way that suggested I belonged here, that my presence was intentional rather than desperate. The gallery's interior hummed with that particular quiet of expensive spaces, climate-controlled air, subtle classical music, the soft footfalls of the few early visitors already examining pieces. Eleanor Morrison stood near a bronze sculpture in the center of the room, her silver hair pulled back in a chignon that looked effortlessly elegant. She wore all black, turtleneck, slacks, architectural jewelry that could have been art itself. Her fingers traced the sculpture's curves while she spoke quietly into her phone, something about shipping logistics and insurance valuations. I waited, clutching my tote bag with the vase inside, now wrapped in my best scarf because the bubble wrap had seemed too cheap, too obviously desperate for this space. The scarf had been my mother's, silk with a pattern of birds that she'd bought on her honeymoon in Paris. It felt right somehow, protecting one piece of dismissed beauty with another. Eleanor ended her call and turned, her eyes landing on me with the kind of assessment that felt like being X-rayed. She took in my coat, my bag, my stance, and something in her expression shifted. Not pity, not dismissal, but curiosity. "Can I help you?" Her voice carried authority softened by genuine interest. The pitch I'd practiced dissolved. Instead, truth tumbled out raw and unvarnished. "My name is Stella Brennan. Last night, my husband threw my anniversary gift in the trash because it wasn't real enough for him. He's married to someone else now, someone who owns a gallery and apparently knows what real art looks like. But I think what I made might actually be something. And I remembered you speaking at the ceramic symposium last year about finding authenticity in unexpected places." Eleanor's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You were there. Third row. Blue notebook. You talked about how the best art comes from genuine emotion, not manufactured sentiment." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Show me." My hands trembled as I unwrapped the scarf, revealing the vase to the gallery's perfect lighting. The chrysanthemums seemed to come alive, each petal catching and reflecting light in ways that made them appear to breathe. Eleanor circled the piece twice, her fingers hovering just above the surface, never quite touching. The silence stretched so long I became aware of my own heartbeat, of the climate-controlled air moving through my lungs, of the weight of everything resting on this moment. Finally, she pulled out her phone, never taking her eyes off the vase. "Marcus, clear the Fifth Avenue window display. We have something special." My legs gave out completely. The expensive leather chair in Eleanor's office caught me as I collapsed into it, the number she had just spoken reverberating through my skull like a bell struck too hard. $170,000. For something that had been sitting in my trash 12 hours ago. "I need you to understand what we're dealing with here," Eleanor said, settling behind her glass desk with the practiced grace of someone who had delivered life-changing news before. "This isn't just about the technical skill, though your glazing technique is genuinely revolutionary. The way you've layered the colors to create depth, how the chrysanthemums appear to be simultaneously blooming and withering, that's museum-quality work." My mouth opened but no words emerged. Museum quality. The same piece Dylan had dropped into our kitchen garbage without a second thought. Eleanor continued, her fingers steepled as she studied me. "But what makes this truly valuable is the story. A woman's artistic vision, literally discarded by a man who couldn't recognize mastery when he held it in his hands. The collectors who shop here, they don't just buy art. They buy meaning, narrative, vindication. Your vase is all three." She turned her computer screen toward me, showing a mock-up of the window display. The vase would sit alone on a white pedestal, dramatic spotlights creating shadows that made the chrysanthemums appear three-dimensional. Below it, a gold placard with text that made my breath catch. "Chrysanthemums for the blind, a study in dismissed brilliance. Opening bid, $170,000. We'll have it installed by tomorrow morning," Eleanor said, already typing something on her phone. "Marcus will handle the lighting. I'll personally write the piece's story for our catalog. Every major collector in the city will know about this by week's end." I signed papers in a daze, my signature looking foreign on documents that contained more zeros than I had ever seen associated with my name. Eleanor assigned me a liaison, a young woman named Catherine who would handle all communications and keep me updated on interest in the piece. She handed me a business card with the gallery's logo embossed in gold, my name already added as featured artist beneath it. The subway ride home felt surreal, like moving through a dream where familiar things had taken on strange new dimensions. I clutched the business card so tightly it left indentations in my palm. By the time I reached my stop, my phone had started its assault. The first notification came from my cousin in New Jersey, a Facebook message with 14 exclamation points. Is this your vase in the Morrison Gallery window? Attached was a photo clearly taken through the glass, the display even more magnificent than the mock-up had suggested. The lighting made my chrysanthemums glow like they contained their own fire. Within an hour my phone became unusable. High school acquaintances I had not spoken to in 15 years suddenly remembered we were best friends. Distant relatives emerged from social media dormancy to congratulate me on my success. My former pottery teacher, Mrs. Chin, sent a photo of herself standing in front of the display with tears streaming down her face, accompanied by a long message about how she had always known I was special, how she had seen my potential from day one. Interesting, considering she had spent 2 years telling me my technique was too unconventional, that I needed to follow established methods if I wanted to succeed. Then Dylan's name appeared on my screen. A text, then another in rapid succession. What kind of game are you playing? Stella, this is completely inappropriate. You need to take that down immediately. This affects my professional reputation. Answer your phone. 17 missed calls accumulated while I sat at my kitchen table eating cereal from the box, watching my phone light up like a crisis hotline. I screenshot every message, every missed call notification, creating a digital record of his panic. But I did not respond. Not a single word. Instead, I opened Instagram, where the situation had already exploded beyond my comprehension. Someone with 2 million followers had posted a photo of themselves in front of the gallery window with the caption, "This queen threw her art in the trash and now it's worth $170,000. Know your worth, ladies." The hashtags multiplied like cells dividing. Hashtag trash to treasure, hashtag know your worth, hashtag artistic justice, hashtag queen energy. The story had already morphed, details shifting with each retelling. Some posts claimed Dylan had burned my previous works. Others said he had laughed while throwing it away. One particularly creative account insisted he had tried to steal it back once he learned its value. The truth, that he had simply dismissed it as unimportant, seemed insufficient for the internet's hunger for drama. My phone rang again, but this time it was my mother calling from Florida. I stared at her contact photo, taken 3 Christmases ago when we had all pretended to be a happy family, before answering. "Stella, honey, I'm looking at a photo of your vase on Facebook. Is this real? Is that really your piece?" Her voice carried a mixture of pride and hurt that made my chest tighten. "It's real, Mom. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? The problems with Dylan, your art being in a gallery. I had to find out from Cousin Rita's Facebook post." The accusation in her voice was justified. I had spent 2 years making excuses for missing family gatherings, claiming work conflicts when really I could not bear to pretend everything was fine while Dylan grew more distant and Amelia grew more contemptuous. "I didn't know how to explain it," I said quietly. "How do you tell your mother that your husband has been married to someone else for 6 months? That your own daughter thinks you're an embarrassment?" The silence stretched across the miles between us. Finally she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "You tell her the truth. You let her help. You don't carry it alone. Sometimes you don't know you're drowning until someone throws you a life preserver," I said, the words coming out more philosophical than intended. Another long pause. I could hear her breathing, could picture her in her sunny Florida kitchen with the yellow walls she had painted herself, surrounded by her own art that Dad had always called her little projects. "I'm booking a flight," she said finally. "For the auction. Whatever happens, you won't be alone for it." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, phone still lighting up with notifications I no longer bothered to read. 3 days ago I had been invisible, my work deemed literal garbage by the person who was supposed to value it most. Now strangers were calling me queen, sharing my story like it was their own victory, turning my humiliation into their inspiration. The transformation felt too quick, too surreal, like emotional whiplash that left me dizzy and disoriented. My vase sat in a window on 5th Avenue, worth more than Dylan made in a year, and I sat alone eating dry cereal in an apartment that still smelled faintly of the anniversary dinner no one had wanted. The cereal box sat empty on my counter when the sharp knock came Thursday evening. Through the peephole I saw Dylan's face, flushed and angry, with a woman behind him who could only be Hazel. She stood like someone who had never doubted her place in the world, her architectural glasses reflecting the harsh hallway fluorescence, her black dress so perfectly minimalist it probably cost more than my monthly rent. I opened the door slowly, deliberately, letting them wait an extra second before meeting Dylan's eyes. He pushed past me without invitation, the gesture so familiar it almost made me laugh. 12 years of marriage and he still moved through space like he owned it. "You need to stop this," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends now." Hazel followed him in, her heels clicking against my worn hardwood floors with surgical precision. She surveyed my apartment with the kind of quick assessment that cataloged and dismissed everything in seconds. The mismatched furniture. The water stain on the ceiling. The stack of library books on my coffee table. I watched her file it all away as evidence of my insignificance. "Mrs. Brennan," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that could rot teeth. "I'm Hazel Morrison. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about your craft project." Craft project. The words hung in the air between us, calculated to diminish, to put me back in what she considered my place. This woman who had stolen my husband, who had bought my daughter's affection with designer clothes, who owned a gallery but somehow could not recognize actual artistry when her new husband threw it in the garbage. "There's no misunderstanding," I said, remaining by the door, refusing to move deeper into my own home. "The piece is in Eleanor Morrison's gallery. The bid starts at $170,000. 3 collectors have already submitted sealed bids above that amount." Dylan's jaw clenched. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Hazel's reputation? People are calling her gallery, asking if she's the woman who married the man too stupid to recognize valuable art. They're questioning her judgment, her eye for talent." The irony was so thick I could have served it for dinner. I pulled out my phone, swiping to the email that had arrived that morning. "Speaking of reputations," I said, holding the screen toward them, "the Guggenheim would like to feature my vase in their upcoming exhibition on overlooked female artists. They're calling it a defining piece of contemporary ceramic art." Hazel's face went pale beneath her perfect foundation. She reached for the phone, but I pulled it back, not willing to let her touch even that small part of my new reality. Her composure cracked slightly, revealing something desperate underneath. "That piece isn't worth that kind of money," she insisted, her voice losing its honeyed coating. "This is clearly a spite-fueled publicity stunt. You're embarrassing yourself." The accusation might have stung if it had come from someone whose opinion mattered, from someone who had not participated in dismantling my life piece by piece. But from Hazel, standing in my apartment wearing my husband like an accessory, the words were meaningless noise. "Embarrassing myself?" I repeated, letting the absurdity of the statement hang in the air. "I'm not the one who failed to recognize a $170,000 piece of art while claiming to be a gallery owner. I'm not the one who convinced a married man to abandon his family for someone who can't tell the difference between trash and treasure." That's when I noticed movement in the hallway. Amelia stood just outside the door, hovering at the threshold like she was afraid to fully enter. She looked smaller somehow, uncertain in a way I had not seen since she was much younger. The designer jacket that had seemed so important days ago now appeared to weigh her down. "Mom." Her voice was quiet, almost lost. "Is it really worth that much?" For the first time in months, she looked like my daughter instead of Dylan's ally. The confidence she had worn like armor when she laughed at my gift had evaporated, replaced by something that might have been regret. "The current highest sealed bid is $210,000, I said, keeping my voice steady, factual. "The auction is Tuesday." Amelia's eyes widened, darting between Dylan and me like she was seeing us both for the first time. The math was simple enough for a 16-year-old to understand. Her father had thrown away more money than most people see in a lifetime. He had declared worthless something that experts were fighting to own. Dylan noticed her presence and his tactics shifted immediately. "This is what I'm talking about, Stella. You're humiliating our daughter. Her friends at school are all talking about this. You're affecting her life with this vindictive display." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Using Amelia as a shield, weaponizing parental concern when he had taken her to celebrate with his new wife the night he threw away my gift. "I'm succeeding publicly," I said, my voice clear and steady. "You humiliated yourself privately when you decided that something made with love had no value. I just gave the world a chance to disagree with your assessment." Hazel stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Be reasonable. This affects all of us. We could work out an arrangement, perhaps feature some of your work in my gallery, give you legitimate representation." The offer was so absurd I actually laughed. You want to represent me? After your husband threw my work in the trash? After you convinced my daughter that my art was worthless? I didn't. Amelia started, then stopped, her face crumpling slightly. I didn't know. Those 3 words carried more weight than any apology could have. She didn't know because she hadn't bothered to look. She had been so dazzled by Hazel's designer world, by the promise of expensive things and gallery connections, that she had forgotten who taught her to mix colors when she was 3 years old, who had shown her how to find beauty in ordinary things. The Rolex, I said suddenly, looking at Dylan's wrist where the watch gleamed under my apartment's cheap lighting. The $18,000 gift from your new wife. Is it even real? Hazel's face flushed, a tell so obvious it answered the question without words. Dylan's hand moved instinctively to cover the watch, his expression shifting from anger to uncertainty. That's irrelevant, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. Is it? I asked. You threw away authentic art for a fake watch. That seems entirely relevant. They left after that, their exit less dramatic than their entrance. Dylan muttered something about lawyers and damages, Hazel's heels clicked with less certainty, and Amelia lingered in the doorway for one long moment. Something in her eyes had changed, a recognition perhaps of what she had laughed at, what she had dismissed, what she had thrown away along with her father. After the door closed, I stood in my empty apartment, surrounded by the echoes of their visit, and felt something I had not experienced in years. Not quite peace but clarity. The kind that comes from standing your ground when everything in you wants to collapse. Tuesday morning arrived with unseasonable rain that turned Manhattan into a watercolor painting through my window. My mother sat at my kitchen table, having arrived from Florida the night before, her presence both comforting and strange in the apartment where I had hidden my failing marriage for so long. She held her coffee with both hands, studying me over the rim with eyes that saw too much. You look different, she said quietly. Stronger. I wanted to tell her that strength was just exhaustion wearing makeup, but instead I smoothed down the black dress I had bought yesterday with my credit card. A small act of faith that today would change everything. The dress cost more than I usually spent on clothes in 6 months, but it felt like armor I needed for what was coming. The Morrison Gallery had transformed for the auction. Rows of velvet chairs faced a raised platform where Eleanor would conduct the sale. My vase sat on a pedestal beside the podium, spotlit like a performer waiting for their cue. The chrysanthemums seemed to pulse with life under the lights, and I had to remind myself that this was real, that the piece I had pulled from garbage was about to be sold to the highest bidder. My mother gripped my hand as we took seats in the back row. Her fingers were warm and steady, anchoring me as the room filled with people whose jewelry probably cost more than my annual salary. Women in understated designer clothes that whispered rather than shouted their price tags. Men in suits that fit like second skins. And scattered throughout, journalists with notebooks and photographers adjusting their lenses. Eleanor took the podium with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times. She spoke about my vase with reverence, describing the technical mastery of the glazing, the emotional resonance of flowers captured in the moment between bloom and decay. Then she told the story, carefully, diplomatically, but with enough detail that everyone understood. This piece had been thrown away by someone who failed to recognize its value. It had been rescued, cleaned of garbage, and brought to her by an artist who refused to let dismissal be the final word. We'll open bidding at $170,000, Eleanor announced. A paddle rose immediately from the second row. Then another from the fifth. The numbers climbed with dizzying speed. 175, 180, 185. My mother's grip on my hand tightened with each increase. At 190,000, a woman in the third row raised her paddle with particular determination. She was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and a face that suggested she had fought battles and won them. Her eyes never left my vase as she continued bidding against 2 other collectors. 200,000, Eleanor announced as her paddle rose again. 205,000. 210,000. At 220,000, someone else entered the bidding, and the gray-haired woman's shoulders sagged slightly as she was outbid. During the brief break, Eleanor called to allow serious bidders to consider their limits. The woman found me in the back row. I wanted you to know, she said, her voice thick with emotion, seeing your piece in that window saved me. She sat down in the empty chair beside me, uninvited but welcome. I'm going through a divorce. 23 years of marriage, and my husband keeps telling the lawyers that my nonprofit work is just an expensive hobby. That the shelter I built from nothing that houses 40 women a night is just something I do to fill time. Her eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. When I read about your vase, about how it went from trash to treasure, I finally understood. The value was always there. It didn't need his recognition to exist. That night, I filed the papers I'd been too scared to submit. She squeezed my hand once, firmly, then returned to her seat as Eleanor called the room back to order. The bidding resumed with fresh intensity. 2 new bidders had entered during the break, driving the price past $220,000, then $230,000. The winning bid came from a woman in the front row who had waited until the very end to raise her paddle. $237,000, Eleanor announced, and the room erupted in applause as the hammer fell. The buyer was Judith Hartley, a Houston oil heiress known for her collection of feminist art. She approached me after the sale with tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, gripping my hands with surprising strength. 3 marriages, she said without preamble. 3 men who told me my interests were hobbies. My first husband said my paintings were craft projects. My second said my poetry was self-indulgent. My third called my philanthropy a tax write-off with delusions of grandeur. She pulled me into an embrace that smelled of expensive perfume and determination. I've spent 20 years collecting art by women who were told they weren't real artists. Your vase isn't just ceramic and glaze. It's a monument to every woman whose worth went unrecognized, whose contributions were dismissed, whose love was treated as worthless. Judith released me but kept hold of my hands. This piece will be the centerpiece of my collection. And every time someone asks about it, I'll tell them exactly where it came from. The trash can of a man too blind to see treasure. Eleanor handled the press with practiced expertise, ensuring every reporter understood the piece's journey from garbage to a nearly $250,000 sale. Dylan's name was never mentioned directly, professional courtesy preventing that level of exposure, but everyone in our social circle would know. The story was too specific, too unique to be anyone else. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret, my pottery student. A photo of her standing in the Metropolitan Museum beside one of her needlework pieces, recently acquired from her late husband's estate. He said my work was silly, her message read. The museum paid $2 million for silly. Just saw the news about your auction. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Creating treasures for men who couldn't see past their own limitations. I showed the message to my mother, who read it twice before speaking. Your grandmother would have loved this, she said softly. She died believing her paintings were worthless because that's what she was told. But you proved that the truth eventually surfaces. Catherine from the gallery approached with paperwork and a check that would change everything. Not just financially but fundamentally. After the gallery's commission, I would receive enough to start over, to never again stay in a relationship because I couldn't afford to leave, to never again accept someone else's assessment of my value. The rain had stopped by the time we left the gallery. Sun broke through the clouds, turning the wet streets into mirrors that reflected the city back at itself. My mother linked her arm through mine as we walked, and for the first time in years I didn't feel like I was drowning. The check cleared on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, I stood in the center of a sun-filled studio space in Brooklyn, keys heavy in my hand. The realtor had already left, and I was alone with 2,000 square feet of possibility. Windows stretched from floor to ceiling along the entire east wall, flooding the space with the kind of natural light I had only dreamed about in our cramped Manhattan apartment. The concrete floors were splattered with paint from the previous tenant, an abstract painter who had moved to Paris. I saw those stains not as flaws but as evidence that art had lived here before and would live here again. The moving truck arrived with my few possessions, looking almost embarrassed by the vastness of the space. My pottery wheel, rescued from the community center's storage closet where I had been keeping it, took its place near the windows. The work table Dylan had always complained about, saying it cluttered our dining area, finally had room to breathe. I arranged my tools on the industrial shelving units I had bought that morning, each item finding its proper place for the first time in years. Within a week, the commission requests overwhelmed my inbox. Catherine from Morrison Gallery forwarded them with barely contained excitement. A tech executive in San Francisco wanted a series of bowls that captured the stages of grief. A hotel chain inquired about custom pieces for their luxury properties. A museum in Boston asked if I would consider teaching a masterclass. The subject line that made me laugh out loud came from someone who identified herself only as a fellow survivor. I need something beautiful that was born from garbage. Name your price. I hired an assistant named Marcus, a recent art school graduate who approached pottery with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. He handled the business side of things, scheduling, supplies, correspondence, while I focused on creating. The irony of needing help to manage what Dylan had dismissed as my little hobby was not lost on either of us. 3 weeks into my new life, Amelia appeared in my doorway on a Saturday afternoon. She stood there holding a shopping bag, her posture uncertain, like she needed permission to enter this space that represented my life without her and her father. The designer jacket was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she wore jeans and an old sweater I remembered buying her 2 years ago. "Mom." Her voice was smaller than I had heard it in months. "Can I come in?" I set down the bowl I had been glazing and really looked at my daughter for the first time since the anniversary disaster. She seemed diminished somehow, like she had been carrying weight that finally proved too heavy. I nodded and she entered slowly, taking in the space with wide eyes. "This is incredible," she said, walking to the windows where afternoon light turned her hair golden. "You did all this?" "The auction did this," I corrected but gently. She turned to face me and I saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Dad and Hazel fight all the time now. She keeps telling him he has no eye for value, that he wouldn't recognize quality if it bit him. She brings up your vase in every argument." Amelia sat down on the stool beside my wheel, the shopping bag in her lap. "Last week, Dad tried to get his Rolex serviced. The one Hazel gave him. The store told him it was fake. A really good fake, but fake. He came home and they had this massive fight. She admitted she bought it online from some guy who sells replicas. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. The woman who preached about real value, who owned a gallery, who had convinced Dylan that my authentic work was worthless, had given him a counterfeit gift. I wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I felt sad for all of us caught in this web of perceived versus actual worth. "I brought you something," Amelia said, pulling the designer jacket from her bag. "I want to return it. All of it. The clothes, the jewelry, everything she bought me. It feels wrong now, like I was being bought." She folded the jacket carefully and set it aside, then looked at me with eyes that reminded me of the little girl who used to help me paint birthday cards at our kitchen table. "Can you teach me? Pottery, I mean. I want to learn to make something real." The Times feature appeared that Sunday with a full-page spread in the art section. The headline read, "From Trash to Treasure. When Divorce Becomes Art," accompanied by a photo Catherine had taken of me at my new wheel. My hands were covered in clay, my expression focused but peaceful, and the light from those windows made everything glow. The article told my story without mentioning Dylan by name, but included enough detail that anyone who knew us would understand. Dylan's law firm, according to Amelia, had strongly suggested he take a leave of absence until the media attention subsided. Hazel's gallery had seen a 40% drop in foot traffic, with several artists requesting their work be returned. The art world, it seemed, did not appreciate someone who failed to recognize valuable work, especially when that someone claimed expertise. I positioned Amelia at the wheel, placing her hands on the clay exactly as my teacher had positioned mine years ago. "The first thing to learn is centering," I told her. "Everything depends on finding the center." She struggled at first, the clay wobbling and threatening to fly off the wheel. But gradually, with patience I did not know she possessed, she found the rhythm. The clay smoothed under her palms, rising and falling with her breath. "Your vase was beautiful," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the spinning clay. I knew it that night. I wanted to be part of their world so badly. The gallery openings, the expensive things, the feeling of being sophisticated. I thought that was what success looked like. "What does it look like now?" I asked. She glanced around the studio at the afternoon light painting gold stripes across the concrete floor, at the shelves holding my new work, at the space I had claimed as entirely my own. "Like this," she said simply. "It looks like this." I guided her hands as the clay began to take shape, a simple bowl emerging from formlessness. "Apologies are like glazes," I told her, remembering something my grandmother used to say. "They work best when applied with genuine intention and proper timing." "Is mine?" she asked, vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. "Is my timing right?" I touched her shoulder gently, feeling the tension she had been carrying begin to ease. Your timing, I said, watching her hands find their own rhythm on the clay, is perfect. The clay had dried on Amelia's first bowl, and we sat together in comfortable silence as I showed her how to prepare it for the kiln. 6 months had passed since that afternoon when she first asked me to teach her, and the change in both of us felt profound. The studio had become our sanctuary, a place where we rebuilt not just our relationship but ourselves. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, Eleanor's elegant handwriting on cream cardstock. Your solo exhibition, she had written. 23 pieces. Let's show the world what rising from ashes looks like. I read it 3 times before the words felt real. My own exhibition at Morrison Gallery, the same space where my vase had sold for more than I had ever imagined possible. The months of preparation passed in a blur of creation. Each piece explored a different aspect of dismissal and recognition, value and worth. A series of plates that appeared broken until you looked closer and saw how the cracks formed patterns of flowers. Bowls that seemed to contain storms, glazed in colors that shifted from despair to hope depending on the angle of view. And at the center of it all, on loan from Judith Hartley's collection and now insured for $500,000, the chrysanthemum vase that had started everything. Opening night arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made New York feel like a movie set. Amelia stood beside me at the gallery entrance, wearing a simple navy dress she had bought with money from her part-time job at a local bookstore. 3 weeks earlier she had returned everything Hazel had given her, packaging each item carefully with a note that said simply, I prefer things with authentic value. You ready for this? She asked, squeezing my hand as the first guests began arriving. No, I admitted, watching as the gallery filled with collectors, critics, journalists and curious observers. But I've learned that ready is overrated. My mother had flown in again from Florida, this time bringing my sister whom I had not seen in 2 years. They stood near the window display, my mother explaining to anyone who would listen that she had always known I would succeed, conveniently forgetting the years of suggesting I find a more stable career. But I did not mind the revision. She was here and that mattered more than accuracy. Eleanor commanded the room's attention for the opening toast, her champagne glass catching the light as she raised it high. 6 months ago, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed space. A woman walked into this gallery with a vase wrapped in a scarf. That vase had been thrown in the garbage by someone who could not recognize its value. Tonight we celebrate not just the art, but the artist who proved that one person's trash is sometimes a masterpiece waiting for the right eyes to see it. The crowd murmured its agreement, glasses raising in response. Stella Brennan's work reminds us that we should all learn to recognize value when it stands before us, Eleanor continued. Especially when it comes bearing gifts of the heart. Too often we dismiss what is made with love in favor of what comes with a price tag. Her journey from that garbage can to this gallery is a testament to the power of believing in your own worth, even when no one else does. The applause that followed felt physical, washing over me with the warmth I remembered from my kills. My mother's hand found my shoulder, squeezing with the kind of pride that needed no words, that transcended the years of misunderstanding between us. That is when I saw him. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, across the street in the shadow of a closed storefront, Dylan stood alone. He wore one of his expensive suits, the real Rolex glinting on his wrist under the streetlight. His face carried an expression I had never seen during our marriage, genuine recognition of loss. Not the petulant frustration of being wrong, but the deeper understanding of having discarded something irreplaceable. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass and the crowd and the years of accumulated hurt. I waited for the surge of satisfaction, for the vindictive pleasure of seeing him witness my success. But it never came. Instead, I felt something lighter, cleaner. I offered him the smallest nod, not forgiveness, not invitation, just acknowledgement that he had played his part in bringing me here. Then I turned back to my world, to the people celebrating my work, to the life I had built from the rubble of what he had destroyed. Marcus appeared at my elbow, tablet in hand, barely containing his excitement. 3 pieces sold in the first 20 minutes, he whispered. The storm bowls went to a collector from Chicago. She said they perfectly captured her divorce. By the end of the evening, the exhibition had sold out completely. 23 pieces finding new homes with people who understood their value, who saw beauty in the cracks and strength in the imperfections. Commission requests filled my inbox faster than Marcus could document them, bookings extending through the next year and beyond. As the crowd began to thin, Judith Hartley approached with tears in her eyes. She stood before the chrysanthemum vase, her hand pressed to the glass case that protected it. "Every time I look at this piece," she said softly, "I remember that value exists whether others acknowledge it or not. You've given so many of us permission to stop waiting for recognition and start recognizing ourselves." Amelia appeared beside me as the photographers gathered for final shots. She had spent the evening talking to visitors about the work, explaining techniques I had taught her, her enthusiasm genuine and infectious. As the cameras flashed, she leaned close and whispered, "I'm proud to be your daughter." The words landed in my chest with the weight of everything we had traveled through to reach this moment. The laughter at my anniversary gift. The choosing of sides. The months of silence. And now this, standing together in a gallery filled with my work, her hand in mine, both of us understanding what it meant to create something real. Later, as the gallery emptied and the lights dimmed to their after-hours glow, I stood alone with my pieces one final time. Each one had started as raw clay, shapeless and without worth until touched by intention and fire. The metaphor was not subtle, but then again the best truths rarely are. I thought about that night 12 months ago, standing in my kitchen in a discount dress, watching my marriage end with the thud of ceramic hitting garbage. If someone had told me then that the vase would sell for nearly $250,000, that I would have my own exhibition, that my daughter would return to me with genuine love instead of obligation, I would have thought them delusional. But here I stood, surrounded by proof that sometimes the garbage can is not an ending but a beginning. That sometimes dismissal is just redirection toward people who can actually see you. That sometimes the price tag, whether it is $237,000 or any other number, matters far less than the moment you finally understand your own worth. If this story of transformation and triumph had you cheering for Stella's victory, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Eleanor cleared the Fifth Avenue window display for a vase pulled from the trash, knowing exactly what recognition was coming. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more inspiring stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Go ahead, walk away. My wealthy husband challenged me, saying I wouldn't survive a week without him. I simply dropped my keys on the counter of the house he paid for. The very next day his boss and father were in a frenzy, calling non-stop. And now the bank is ringing off the hook. What exactly did you push her into doing? You wouldn't last a week without me, Mila. Ashton set down his crystal tumbler, the Macallan inside catching the light from our chandelier. Without my money, my connections, my protection, you'd be nobody again. Just another pretty face waiting tables or answering phones. He straightened his Hermes tie, waiting for me to beg, to cry, to promise I'd never leave. Instead, I reached into my Chanel bag and pulled out my keys. House. Range Rover. Safe. I lined them up on our granite counter, each one clicking against the stone. You're right, I said. Let's find out. The color drained from his face as I walked toward the door, leaving everything he'd bought me behind. But that was 3 hours ago. Now I sat in the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton watching the security footage on my phone. Yes, I had access to our penthouse cameras, another thing Ashton never knew I understood. He was pacing our kitchen, picking up the keys, setting them down, calling someone. Probably Nathan. Maybe his father. Definitely not the police, because what would he say? My wife left her keys and walked out? The concierge approached with a gentle smile. Miss Hawthorne, your suite is ready. My maiden name felt strange on my tongue when I'd made the reservation this morning, but it was mine, the one thing Ashton couldn't buy or sell or trade. I'd paid with my own money, 6 figures accumulated from what Ashton called my cute little hobby of day trading. He'd laugh at parties telling people I played with stocks like other wives played tennis. Nobody knew I'd turned his initial allowance of $10,000 into enough to live on for years. The suite was smaller than our penthouse but infinitely larger in possibility. I set down my single suitcase, the one I'd hidden at my gym months ago, slowly filling it with essentials every visit. Ashton monitored our credit cards but never questioned gym trips. After all, trophy wives needed to maintain their value. My phone buzzed. 17 missed calls already. I deleted his contact, watched his number become just digits on a screen. The first voicemail played accidentally when I tried to silence it. Mila, this is ridiculous. Come home. We'll talk about whatever upset you. His voice had that controlled quality, like he was handling a volatile investment instead of a wife. By the fifth message, the control was cracking. You can't just leave. Half of everything is in both our names. You need my signature too. I deleted them all. The morning felt like a different lifetime. I'd woken at 6 a.m. as always, alone in our California king bed because Ashton had fallen asleep in his study again, surrounded by monitors showing after-hours trading in Tokyo. The coffee maker was already programmed. Despite what he told his friends, I'd learned to use every appliance in that kitchen. He claimed I couldn't operate a toaster at last month's dinner party. Everyone laughed. Even me, the good wife who knew her role. I'd stood at our floor-to-ceiling windows 23 floors up, watching the city wake. The silk robe he'd given me for Christmas itched against my skin. Designer label, wrong size, chosen by his assistant who thought all wives wore size 2. Today was our anniversary. For years. He hadn't mentioned it once this week, but I'd stopped expecting him to remember after year 2. The charity luncheon invitations sat on our marble counter. Another command performance where I'd smile while the wives compared vacation homes. Helen Brennan would ask about my little hobby, with that patronizing smile. Still playing with your phone stocks, dear? She'd say, not knowing I'd made more this quarter than her husband's dental practice. That's when I decided to organize Ashton's study, looking for our insurance documents. He was always particular about his space, everything arranged just so. The voice recorder sat on his desk, that little silver device he used for important thoughts. When I knocked it over reaching for files, it clattered onto the marble floor and started playing. His voice filled the room mid-conversation. She asked to see our investment statements yesterday. Laughter. I told her they were too complicated, lots of numbers. He actually believed me. Nathan, I could get her to sign over her kidneys and she'd just ask what pen to use. My hands had trembled as I picked it up, saw the date. Last Tuesday. The day I'd brought him lunch at his office, surprising him with his favorite sushi. He'd seemed so pleased, introducing me to his new analyst as the beautiful Mrs. Whitmore. Now I understood the smirk on the analyst's face. The recording kept going. That's why this type is perfect, Ashton continued. Pretty enough for photos, dumb enough to control, grateful enough to stay quiet. My father taught me well. Marry beauty, rent intelligence. I'd placed the recorder back exactly where it had fallen, angled precisely how he'd left it. Then I'd found the insurance papers and something else. A folder marked prenuptial amendments. Documents dated last month, adding clauses about abandonment, forfeit of assets if I left without just cause. Already notarized with my signature, forged but expertly so. Standing in that study, surrounded by evidence of his success and my insignificance, something crystallized. He wasn't just dismissive or cruel. He was systematic. I was an investment and he was already planning my depreciation. The Ritz suite had a view of our building. I could see our penthouse from here, lights blazing as Ashton probably tore through his office, looking for signs of what I'd taken. He wouldn't find any. I'd only photographed documents, only copied files to clouds he didn't know existed. The real theft would come later, legally, through the 50% of everything he'd put in my name for tax benefits. My phone rang again. This time Richard Whitmore. Ashton's father, calling personally. I let it ring, remembering how he'd introduced me at his last party. Ashton's wife. Pretty thing, isn't she? Like I was a coat or a watch, something to be appraised and approved. Margaret's text came through then, the secretary who'd served tea at every family gathering. Heard you left. Room 1247 when you're ready to talk. I have 40 years of information you need. I smiled, the first real smile in months. Ashton said I wouldn't last a week without him. But he'd never asked what I was doing all those hours he left me alone. Never wondered why his secretary knew my maiden name. Never imagined his trophy might have been taking notes. 7 days. That's all I needed to prove him wrong. After that, I'd take the rest of my life proving myself right. The keys I'd left weren't surrender. They were a declaration of war. And unlike Ashton, I'd already read all the terms and conditions. 3 weeks had passed since that night at the Ritz. I'd established a routine. Morning trades from my suite, afternoon walks through Central Park, evenings reviewing the documents Margaret had been feeding me in careful doses. Each file she shared revealed another layer of the Whitmore Empire's corruption. But today was different. Today was May 15th, our actual anniversary date, and despite everything I'd agreed to one dinner. Just to discuss the logistics, Ashton had said on the phone, his voice carefully neutral. We need to be civilized about this. The salon on Fifth Avenue was the same one I'd used throughout our marriage. Celeste, my hairdresser, worked her fingers through my hair with practiced precision. Special occasion? She asked, not recognizing the bitter irony in her question. Anniversary dinner, I said, watching my reflection transform into what Ashton preferred. Sleek, controlled, expensive looking. 4 years, right? How wonderful. Where's he taking you? Le Bernardin. His favorite, where the waiters knew his wine preferences and the chef sent complimentary courses to his regular table. I'd made the reservation myself, knowing he'd forget otherwise. The confirmation email sat in my phone, right next to the 17 legal documents my lawyer had prepared for tonight's real purpose. The dress had cost $8,000, more than most people's monthly salaries, charged to the credit card he hadn't frozen yet. Dark blue, his favorite color on me, though he hadn't commented on my appearance in 6 months. I studied myself in the boutique mirror. Every inch the perfect wife he'd curated, except for the flash drive hidden in my clutch containing 40 gigabytes of evidence. My phone buzzed as I was leaving the salon. Slight change, Ashton's text read. Nathan and Diana joining us. Need to discuss Singapore deal. Same time. Of course. Our anniversary had become a business meeting. I sat in the back of the cab watching Manhattan blur past and typed back, perfect. He wouldn't catch the edge in that single word, wouldn't notice it was the first time I hadn't added a heart emoji or love you to my response. 20 minutes later, another text. Actually, father insists we come to the estate. He's having something catered. 8 p.m. The driver had already turned toward Midtown. Change of plans, I told him, giving Richard's address in Westchester. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was wearing a dress worth a small fortune to eat dinner at the house of a man who'd never bothered to learn my last name before it became Whitmore. Richard's estate sprawled across 12 acres of manicured perfection. The circular drive was full of cars I recognized. Nathan's Bentley, 2 other hedge fund partners' vehicles, even Graham Chen's new Tesla. This wasn't a change of plans. This was an ambush disguised as dinner. Patricia answered the door, Richard's third wife, younger than me at 28. Her smile held the kind of exhausted recognition I'd seen in mirrors lately. Mila, you look stunning, she said, though her eyes said something else entirely. Why did you come? The foyer opened into the main sitting room where Ashton held court, tumbler in hand, his third by the color in his cheeks. He glanced at me, taking in the dress, the hair, the effort, and turned back to his conversation without acknowledgement. Nathan waved. Diana sat apart, nursing a martini with the dedication of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. The lovely Mila. Richard boomed, appearing from his study. He kissed my cheek, reeking of cigars and bourbon. Though I hear you're being not so lovely lately. This separation nonsense. Bad for business, you understand. Margaret appeared with a tray of champagne. Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, enough for me to see she knew exactly what this was. As she handed me a glass, her fingers brushed mine. Some anniversaries, she whispered, barely audible, are about endings, not beginnings. The dining room had been set for 12. I recognized most faces. Business partners, their wives, even Ashton's lawyer, though that realization came later. They'd orchestrated this entire evening to pressure me back into line. I sat in my designated seat between Nathan and Graham's wife, facing a portrait of Richard's father, the original Whitmore who'd built this empire on insider trading and strategic marriages. Dinner arrived in courses. Somewhere between the soup and fish, Ashton started his performance. Funny story about how Mila and I met, he announced, though no one had asked. The room turned toward him with practiced attention. She was at the Milken conference, completely lost. Wandered into a derivatives panel thinking it was about art derivatives. He paused for laughter that came too readily. She asked if hedge funds were about landscaping investments. Literally thought we were discussing garden hedges. The story was fiction. I'd been at that conference presenting my graduate thesis on market manipulation in emerging economies. But that truth didn't fit his narrative of rescuing a beautiful fool. Thank God for lost puppies, Nathan added, raising his glass. They make the best pets. Diana's hand found mine under the table, a gesture meant to comfort. But her pity felt worse than the insults. I squeezed back once, then excused myself. Powder room, I murmured, though everyone knew women didn't powder anything anymore. Richard's study door stood partially open. His computer screen glowed, forgotten in his rush to play host. I slipped inside, memorizing everything. The desk layout, the wall safe behind a terrible reproduction of Monet's water lilies, the filing cabinet marked private. His password was written on a post-it note stuck to his monitor. Richard 3 number 1936. His birth year and his favorite Shakespeare character. These men thought they were so clever. Through the window I could see the dinner table, everyone laughing at something. Ashton was standing now, gesturing with his wine glass, playing the role of successful husband to perfection while his actual wife stood in shadows, gathering intelligence. When I returned, the conversation had shifted to business. Singapore expansion, leverage ratios, risk assessments. The wives sat silent, ornamental, while the men discussed millions like monopoly money. Then Nathan, drunk enough to be cruel, made his pronouncement. You know what Ashton is? He's an empire builder. And Mila here, she's the trophy case. Beautiful, elegant, but ultimately just for display. The laughter that followed had an edge, like they all knew the joke cut deeper than intended. Ashton raised his glass. Best investment I ever made. Great tax benefits, minimal maintenance, and she appreciates in value at all the right social events. Margaret was clearing plates, her movements deliberately slow. Our eyes met across the room, and in her gaze, I saw 40 years of accumulated rage, 40 years of watching women like me be diminished, discarded, replaced. Her slight nod told me everything. She'd heard it all, recorded it all, was ready when I was. Something inside me shifted, not broke but crystallized, hard and clear as the diamond on my finger that suddenly felt like a shackle I was ready to pick. The diamond on my finger caught the light as I walked out of Richard's estate that night, each facet throwing rainbows that felt like tiny promises of revenge. In the car, I pulled out a cheap flip phone from beneath the passenger seat, purchased with cash at a bodega where they didn't ask questions. My fingers typed out a simple message to the only number saved. Tuesday, 2 p.m. Jade Garden, Chinatown. Margaret's reply came within minutes. I'll bring tea. 3 days of waiting felt like 3 years. I maintained my routine at the Ritz, ordered room service, made small trades to keep my mind sharp. Ashton had stopped calling. His lawyer was handling everything now, sending formal letters about reconciliation in the interest of financial stability. Each letter went straight to my shredder, then to Patricia Kim, my new attorney, who lived 2 hours away in Connecticut where Ashton's connections meant nothing. Tuesday arrived gray and humid. The Jade Garden sat squeezed between a funeral home and a shop selling knockoff handbags, its windows fogged with decades of steam from dumpling baskets. No one from Ashton's world would ever find themselves here, which made it perfect. Margaret was already seated in the back corner, wearing a cardigan despite the heat, looking like someone's grandmother who'd gotten lost on her way to church. But her eyes, those eyes held 40 years of carefully documented fury. Mrs. Whitmore, she began, and I cut her off. Hawthorne. I'm using my maiden name now. She smiled, pushing a tin of butter cookies across the table. The tin looked ancient, flowers painted on top, the kind your aunt might use for sewing supplies. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, lay a lipstick tube. Twist the bottom 3 times, then pull, she instructed. The lipstick was actually a flash drive. 16 gigabytes of what Margaret called insurance. Started collecting in 1982, she said, voice barely above the restaurant's din. Richard's first wife, Elena, she knew something was wrong with the books. Asked me to watch, to listen. Then she had her accident. Margaret's fingers made air quotes around the last word. Single car, perfect weather, failed brakes. After that, I kept everything. Every memo, every call transcript I could access, every mistress paid off with company funds, every SEC filing that didn't match internal documents. The waiter brought tea and we fell silent until he left. Margaret poured with steady hands, though I noticed the slight tremor when she mentioned Elena. The second wife, Caroline, she lasted longer. Smart woman, MBA from Wharton. Started asking the right questions in year 4. Richard had her committed for exhaustion. She signed the divorce papers from a psychiatric facility, gave up all claims to avoid indefinite treatment. My tea went cold as Margaret outlined 2 decades of financial crimes, each one meticulously documented on that tiny drive. But she saved the worst for last. Your husband isn't just complicit. He's been grooming Nathan's wife, Diana. There's a paper trail, flowers charged to shell companies, hotel reservations that align with his supposed client meetings. He's planning to leave you, Mila, but first he needs to destroy your credibility. That anniversary dinner? They were all witnesses to your unstable behavior. Walking out, leaving your keys, they'll paint it as a breakdown. The dumpling basket arrived, but neither of us touched it. I was thinking about Diana's hand squeezing mine at dinner, wondering if her sympathy was real or part of another game. That night, I sat in my hotel room with my laptop, the flash drive loaded, scrolling through Margaret's evidence. It was overwhelming, 40 years compressed into folders labeled by year, by crime, by victim. But I needed more. I needed Ashton's own records to corroborate everything. Patricia Kim answered my call on the second ring, despite it being nearly midnight. I need to create a company, I told her. Something that sounds like nothing, that could be anything. When? Tomorrow. That's a rush job. It'll cost. I'll pay triple. 2 hours north on I-95, past the exits for Greenwich and Stamford where Ashton's colleagues lived in their own marble prisons. Patricia's office occupied the second floor of a building that also housed a dentist and a tax preparer. No marble, no modern art, just diplomas on the wall and a coffee maker that had seen better decades. She'd already drawn up the papers. Phantom Rose Holdings LC, incorporated in Delaware, registered in Connecticut with a business address that led to a P.O. box that led to another LLC that led nowhere. The structure is completely legal, she explained, sliding documents across her desk. But complex enough that tracing it would take months of dedicated forensic accounting. By then you'll have accomplished whatever you're planning. How do you know I'm planning something? Patricia leaned back, studying me. Because women who pay triple for Rush Incorporation don't do it for fun. They do it for survival. A week later, Ashton left for Singapore. 5 days of meetings about expansion into Asian markets, he'd said, though I knew from Margaret's intelligence that he was really setting up accounts I'd never be able to touch. The housekeeper, Maria, seemed relieved when I told her to take the week off, paid vacation. Spring cleaning, I explained. I need to do this myself. Alone in our penthouse, I became someone else. Not the trophy wife, not the ornament, but a forensic archaeologist excavating evidence of my own destruction. Ashton's office password was embarrassingly sentimental. Our wedding date, as if that meant something to him beyond a tax advantage. His computer opened like a confession booth. Folders within folders, trades time-stamped to the minute, showing clear patterns. Richard would have lunch with certain executives. Within hours, Ashton would make trades in those companies. The pattern was so obvious once you knew to look for it. In his locked drawer, the one he thought I didn't know about, lay correspondence that made my stomach turn. Not just about Diana but about me. Emails to Nathan discussing my mental fragility, suggestions that I might need professional intervention, plans to have me evaluated by a psychiatrist Richard knew, one who'd testified in Caroline's commitment. My hand stayed steady as I photographed each page, uploaded each file to Phantom Rose Holdings' encrypted cloud storage. Every document went back exactly where I'd found it, aligned to the millimeter. Ashton would return to an office that looked untouched, while I held copies of everything that could destroy him. The final document was in his personal safe. He'd hidden the combination in a book about Warren Buffett, thinking he was clever. Inside, beyond the cash and gold coins, was a single folder marked Exit Strategy. Not for trades or business. For me. A timeline showing when to file for divorce, how to claim abandonment, which assets to hide first. My elimination was scheduled like a merger, complete with profit projections. I photographed it all, then sat in his leather chair looking at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, Margaret was probably filing her own reports. Patricia was setting up the next phase of corporate structures. And Ashton was sleeping soundly in Singapore, dreaming of empires built on the bones of women who'd trusted him. He was wrong about one thing, though. I wasn't just another trophy in his case. I was the one holding the hammer. The hammer in my hand suddenly felt heavier than Ashton's entire mahogany desk. I set down the metaphorical weapon and stood from his chair, my reflection caught in the dark computer screen. A woman I barely recognized, someone harder and more calculating than the girl who'd walked down the aisle 4 years ago. The next morning I returned to my routine at the Equinox on Park Avenue. The pool was my sanctuary, 50 laps where the world dissolved into chlorine and rhythm. I was pulling myself out of the water when Diana appeared, her Lululemon workout set pristine but her face haggard, dark circles poorly concealed under concealer. "Nathan knows," she said without preamble, glancing around the empty pool deck. "About Ashton's messages to me. He hired a private investigator, had our phones cloned." Water dripped from my hair onto the marble tiles. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because whatever you're planning, and don't insult me by pretending you're not, these men don't just get angry when cornered. They get even." She pulled her oversized sunglasses down, revealing a bruise along her jawline, carefully covered but visible this close. "Nathan's already moving assets offshore. Richard's been making calls to judges he golf with. They know something's coming." Before I could respond, she was gone, her heels clicking across the wet floor with purpose. I sat there, chlorine burning my nose, wondering if she'd been sent to test me or warn me. With these people, kindness and cruelty often wore the same mask. That evening, Ashton came home carrying calla lilies, my least favorite flowers, though I'd mentioned it only once 3 years ago. He'd brought roses for every occasion since, when he remembered occasions at all. The lilies meant something. They meant he was paying attention now. "Thought we could have dinner together," he said, setting them on the counter where my keys once lay. "Like we used to." We hadn't eaten together without others present in 6 months. I watched him pour wine, the good Bordeaux he usually saved for clients, and arrange cheese on a plate with unusual care. His hands, normally so steady when signing million-dollar trades, showed the slightest tremor. "I've been thinking," he said, settling across from me at our dining table that seats 12 but had never hosted a family meal. "We should take a vacation. Just us. Maybe that place in Montana with no cell service? Remember how you loved the mountains?" I'd mentioned loving mountains once on our honeymoon, while he'd spent the entire trip on conference calls. The fact he remembered felt like a trap spring-loaded with teeth. "When?" I asked, cutting a piece of manchego with surgical precision. "Next week. Or sooner. Tomorrow even." His eagerness betrayed him. "You seem stressed, Mila. The separation, living in hotels, it's not good for you." He pushed a document across the table. "New insurance papers," he explained, "better coverage for both of us." His eyes tracked my hand as I picked up the pen, watching for hesitation, for signs of suspicion. Under the table, my phone captured every page, Patricia Kim's app running silently, storing images in Phantom Rose's encrypted cloud. "You trust me, don't you?" His question hung between us like a chandelier about to fall. "Completely," I lied, signing my name with the same hand that had documented his plans to destroy me. 3 days later, my mother arrived from Ohio, her presence announced by Ashton himself picking her up from JFK, something he'd never done before. He carried her luggage, complimented her new haircut, asked about her garden with feigned interest so polished it gleamed. "Oh honey," she gasped, pulling me aside in the kitchen while Ashton mixed her a gin and tonic with the precise ratio she preferred. "You didn't tell me things had gotten better." He seems so devoted. The words I wanted to say piled up behind my teeth. "He's performing, Mom. This is a show where you're the audience and I'm the prop, and somewhere there's a finale that ends with me institutionalized or dead." Dad, I smiled. "He's full of surprises." That week became a masterclass in Ashton's abilities. Broadway shows he'd previously called waste of time, dinners at restaurants he'd booked months in advance, though I knew his assistant had pulled strings that morning, a surprise spa day for both of us while he handled some business. Mom glowed under the attention, tears actually forming when he toasted her at dinner, calling her the woman who raised such an incredible daughter. I watched from across the table as he performed the role of perfect son-in-law, and realized with cold clarity that I'd never actually seen Ashton try before. This was him at full power, the charm that had built his empire, directed now at convincing my mother that her daughter was safe. The final night of her visit, she sat on my bed in the guest room holding my hands. "Honey, you've lost weight. And your smile, it's different. Practiced." Her fingers found my cheekbones, sharper now from months of barely eating. "Are you happy?" Behind her, through the doorway, I could see Ashton's shadow in the hallway, listening. "I'm exactly where I planned to be," I said, loud enough for him to hear, ambiguous enough to be true. After Mom left, Margaret texted about meeting somewhere new. The New York Public Library's reading room, where she volunteered teaching literacy to immigrants. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was teaching people to read while surrounded by the city's most powerful illiterates, men who never read the human cost of their contracts. She spread newspaper clippings across the worn wooden table like tarot cards revealing my future. Elena Whitmore, 1994, drove her Mercedes off a bridge, perfect weather, no skid marks. Caroline Whitmore, 2003, institutionalized for exhaustion, divorced while sedated, vanished after signing papers. Jennifer Whitmore, 2015, accused of embezzlement she didn't commit, bankruptcy, last known address a shelter in Detroit. Now look at these. Margaret placed 4 photographs in a row. Elena, Caroline, Jennifer, and me. All blonde, all between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 6 inches. All with the same delicate bone structure that photographed well at charity events. Richard picks them, she said quietly, mindful of the students around us. Like casting calls. Young, beautiful, from middle-class families impressed by wealth. Just smart enough to be interesting, not smart enough to be dangerous. Marry them to Ashton, use them for appearances, then dispose of them in year 4 when they start asking questions. Why year 4? Long enough to establish patterns of instability. Short enough that no real bonds form with the social circle. By year 5 you're either gone or broken. She touched my hand, her skin paper-thin but her grip strong. You're at 4 years, 3 months. Whatever you're planning, Mila, do it now. Elena waited too long. Caroline fought too openly. Jennifer trusted the wrong people. I stared at the women who'd worn my name before me, their faces blurring into a single warning. What happened to you? I asked Margaret. Why did you stay? She was quiet for a moment, organizing the clippings with librarian precision. I was Richard's first secretary's daughter. When she died, he offered me the job out of kindness. I was 19, grateful, stupid. By the time I understood what I was documenting, I was trapped too. Different kind of trap, but still a cage. Now I'm 62, invisible and very, very patient. The students around us packed up their books, the library announcing closing time. As we stood to leave, Margaret handed me one last photo. A young woman, beautiful, blonde, probably 22. Who's this? Madison Hayes. Richard had lunch with her father last week. She just graduated from Penn, engagement announcement expected within 6 months. Margaret's eyes held 4 decades of rage compressed into laser focus. She's the next you unless we stop them now. Madison Hayes's photo burned in my pocket as I left the library. 22 years old, whole life ahead of her, about to walk into the same trap that had caught 4 women before her. I tucked the picture into my wallet behind my old student ID. The one from before I became Mrs. Whitmore, when I still had my own name and my own dreams. The next morning I initiated the first withdrawal. $8,000 from our joint checking. Enough to look like furniture shopping, not enough to trigger Ashton's attention. The bank teller didn't even blink. Mrs. Whitmore buying expensive things was as routine as morning coffee. I converted it to cash at 3 different banks, then deposited it into Phantom Rose Holdings account in Connecticut. Patricia Kim had shown me how to create a paper trail that looked like interior design consulting fees. The IRS loves documentation, she'd said. Even if it's fiction, as long as it's properly filed fiction. That evening, Ashton came home at 9 instead of his usual 7. His tie was loosened, jacket off, scotch already on his breath from whatever bar he'd stopped at between the office and home. I was in the kitchen making myself tea when he stumbled slightly at the doorway. Lost the Morrison account today, he announced, pouring himself 3 fingers of Macallan, though it looked closer to 4. 40 million in assets gone. They said there were concerns about compliance. Can you believe that? Compliance concerns at my firm. I kept my face neutral, though I knew Margaret had sent anonymous tips to Morrison's compliance officer 2 weeks ago. That's unfortunate, I said, watching him drain half the glass in one swallow. Nathan thinks someone's talking to our clients. He poured again, his hand less steady. Says there are rumors about an SEC investigation. Ridiculous. The next day I moved 12,000. The day after 15. Spa treatments, I told the one teller who asked. My husband wanted me to pamper myself. She smiled knowingly, probably thinking of her own husband who never noticed such expenses. Ashton's drinking escalated in perfect proportion to his losses. Every night brought a new crisis. Another client pulling funds, another partner asking questions, another rumor about federal involvement. He'd stand in his study, calls on speaker while he paced and drank, signing whatever I brought him without reading. Power of attorney adjustments, insurance modifications, trust amendments. His signature got sloppier with each passing day. Patricia called Thursday morning from a number I didn't recognize. Can you meet today? Urgent. I found her at a rest stop on I-95, sitting in her sensible Honda, looking like any other suburban lawyer except for the tension in her shoulders. The FBI contacted me, she said without preamble. They know I represent you. They want to talk. My chest tightened. How did they? Richard Whitmore has been under investigation for 18 months. A former employee named Dennis Chin filed a whistleblower complaint. They've been building a case, but they need someone with inside access to corroborate. She handed me a business card. Agent Sarah Coleman. She specifically asked for you. Did you tell them anything? Attorney-client privilege. But Mila, if you're going to move, it has to be now. Once the FBI goes public with their investigation, all assets will be frozen. Everything you haven't moved will be locked in litigation for years. That night I watched Ashton pour his sixth drink before dinner. His phone rang constantly. Nathan, Richard, lawyers, crisis managers. Each call made him drink more, sign more, suspect everyone except the wife, quietly refilling his glass. Maybe you should eat something, I suggested, playing concerned spouse while calculating how much longer his liver could take this pace. Not hungry, he muttered, then looked at me with bloodshot eyes. You've been different lately. Calmer. Therapy, I lied smoothly. Learning to accept what I can't change. Saturday arrived with the monthly ladies' auxiliary meeting at Riverside Country Club. I'd been dreading it, knowing Helen Brennan would be there with her coterie of wives who'd made sport of diminishing me for 4 years. But Patricia's news had lit something inside me, a timer counting down to when I could stop pretending. Helen started before I'd even sat down. Mila, darling, still playing with your little investment apps? So cute when wives have hobbies. Like children with toy kitchens. The room tittered with practiced laughter. Margaret stood in the corner, pouring tea, invisible as wallpaper. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Actually, Helen, I said, my voice carrying across the room, my portfolio is up 340% this year. How's yours doing? Silence fell like a guillotine. Helen's face went from patronizing to shocked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. I'm sorry, what? She managed. 340%. Would you like to see the statements? I particularly enjoyed shorting your husband's pharmaceutical company last month. Made a killing when their patent got rejected. You did know about the patent rejection, right? Helen's face went white. She hadn't known. Around the room, other wives leaned forward, suddenly seeing me as something other than Ashton's pretty accessory. Though I suppose, I continued, stirring sugar into my tea with deliberate calm, some of us prefer real kitchens to toy ones. And some of us prefer real portfolios to playing pretend. Margaret actually smiled. Not much, just a slight upturn of her lips as she refilled my cup. The meeting continued in strange silence, the usual gossip replaced by careful glances in my direction. By evening, Ashton would hear about this. By morning, Richard would know his daughter-in-law had claws. But I didn't care anymore. The timer was running down and I was tired of being underestimated. The explosion came Wednesday. I was in my hotel room when my phone lit up with notifications. Diana had filed for divorce from Nathan and she'd brought receipts. Not just infidelity, 3 mistresses over 2 years, but financial fraud, hidden accounts, and a particularly damning email trail where Nathan discussed removing Diana from the equation with his lawyer. Ashton called me 17 times in an hour. I answered on the 18th. What did you tell her? He demanded without preamble. Tell who? Diana. Nathan thinks I leaked information to her. He says you two were friendly at dinners that you must have. I told her nothing, I said truthfully. Diana had found her own evidence, fought her own war. We were parallel soldiers who'd never compared notes. Through the phone I could hear something crash in his office. He's pulling out of the fund. 20 years of partnership, gone. He says I betrayed him for a woman. His laugh was bitter, broken. Wasn't even interested in Diana. He's too old, too smart. I was just keeping options open. The admission should have hurt, but I felt nothing. Just made a note in my phone, evidence Patricia might need later. You always thought you were smarter than everyone else. I heard Nathan screaming in the background. Well, congratulations, you've destroyed us both. The line went dead. Ashton didn't call back. But Margaret texted an hour later. Richard called emergency meeting. All partners. The empire is cracking. I stared at Margaret's text for a full minute. The words, "The empire is cracking," glowing on my screen like a prophecy finally coming true. My hands moved without conscious thought, pulling a red wig from my closet, purchased with cash 3 weeks ago from a costume shop in Queens where they didn't ask questions. The dress was polyester, off the rack from Target, something Mila Whitmore would never wear. Dark sunglasses completed the transformation into nobody, anyone, someone who didn't exist in the Whitmore's world. Nathan's office building on Madison Avenue had the kind of security that looked impressive but was mostly theater. I'd been there dozens of times as Ashton's wife, knew the guards rotated lunch breaks at 12:30, knew Nathan's assistant Sarah always took 45 minutes to grab sushi from the place 3 blocks over. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt endless. In my purse, a manila envelope held printed screenshots of every message Ashton had sent about Nathan. The mockery, the contempt, the detailed plans to steal his clients once the partnership dissolved. But the real poison was at the bottom. Ashton's financial projections for acquiring Diana after her divorce, complete with calculations about her inherited wealth and how to access it through marriage. Nathan's office door was solid mahogany with his name in gold letters. I slipped the envelope underneath, heard it whisper across his Persian rug, then walked back to the elevator without rushing. The security camera would show a woman who could be anyone, walking with purpose but not urgency. 3 hours later, Margaret forwarded me an email from Ashton's assistant. Partnership dissolution letter received from Nathan Chin. Effective immediately. Legal team requesting emergency meeting. The Warwick Hotel on 54th Street still accepted cash if you had enough of it. I registered under Mila Hawthorne, my maiden name feeling like armor I'd finally remembered how to wear. The room was small but clean with a desk where I set up my laptop and the burner phone Patricia had given me. The SEC whistleblower hotline answered after 12 rings. First an automated system, press 1 for this, 2 for that, like reporting financial crimes was as simple as ordering pizza. Finally, a human voice. Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Division. I need to report systematic insider trading at Whitmore Capital Management, I said, my voice steady as marble. I have 5 years of documented evidence, including time-stamped trades that correspond with material non-public information. The agent, she said her name was Jennifer Liu, stayed quiet while I laid out everything. Richard's lunches with executives followed by Ashton's perfectly timed trades. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the pattern so clear a child could follow it. She asked technical questions that revealed she understood exactly what I was describing. Why are you coming forward now, Mrs. Whitmore? I looked out the window at Manhattan's skyline, all those towers built by men like Richard and Ashton. Because I finally understand that staying silent makes me complicit. And because they're planning to do to another woman what they did to me. After the call, I took Margaret's 40 years of evidence, copied onto 3 separate drives, and placed one in a safety deposit box at Chase, one at Bank of America, and one in Patricia's office safe. The instructions were simple. If anything happened to me, release everything to the FBI, the SEC, and the New York Times simultaneously. That evening, Richard's black Mercedes pulled into our building's garage. I watched from the penthouse window as he emerged, his face tight with something between fury and fear. He didn't bother with the doorman, had his own key, the privilege of a father-in-law who owned 30% of his son's fund. Where are your books? Richard's voice carried through the penthouse before he'd even reached Ashton's study. Dad, what's? The books, Ashton. Now. I made myself small in the kitchen, preparing coffee with deliberate normalcy while their voices rose and fell through the walls. My phone, recording everything, rested against a vase on the hallway table, picking up every word. Nathan's out, Ashton was saying. But we can manage without. Nathan's out, Morrison's out, Chen pulled everything this morning. The FBI was at Chen's office, Ashton. asking questions about our trading patterns. That's impossible. Everything we do was bulletproof. Until someone started talking. Richard's voice dropped dangerously. You promised me the wives were handled. Said Mila was too stupid to understand what she was signing. She is, Ashton insisted. She doesn't even know how to read a financial statement. I entered with the coffee tray, my face perfectly blank, the devoted wife serving drinks while her world discussed her like furniture. They both looked at me, Richard with cold assessment, Ashton with dismissive certainty. Cream. I asked Richard. He ignored me, turning back to his son. Find the leak. Fix it. Or we're all finished. They worked until 2 a.m., spreading papers across Ashton's study like tarot cards that might reveal their future. I heard Ashton's printer running constantly, documents being shredded, calls to lawyers who charged $2,000 an hour to answer phones at midnight. By 3 a.m. Ashton had passed out in his chair, surrounded by evidence of his crumbling empire. His head rested on a stack of contracts, drool pooling on papers worth millions. The mighty financial genius, reduced to an exhausted man who'd built his throne on the bones of women he'd underestimated. I moved through our penthouse one last time, not with nostalgia but with the clinical efficiency of someone already gone. My clothes stayed in the closet. Let him explain to people why his wife left everything behind. The jewelry remained in its boxes. Blood diamonds and gilt gold that had never truly been mine. In my purse. My laptop, my real identification and the banking information for Phantom Rose Holdings, which now held exactly 50% of our liquid assets, legally withdrawn over the past weeks. The keys went on the granite counter where this had all started. House key, car key, safe key, lined up with military precision. Next to them, a single note on my personal stationery, the expensive kind he'd bought to make me look the part. Check your accounts. The doorman didn't question why Mrs. Whitmore was leaving at 3 a.m. with only her purse. In their world, the rich did whatever they wanted whenever they wanted. He'd probably seen stranger things. The October air hit my face as I stepped onto the street, cold and sharp and absolutely perfect. Behind me, 23 floors up, Ashton slept in his chair, unaware that his wife had just fired the first shot in a war he didn't know had already begun. In 6 hours he'd wake to find his accounts halved, his partners gone and the FBI closing in. The Uber driver asked where to, and for the first time in 4 years I gave an address that was entirely my own. The Uber dropped me at the Warwick Hotel just as the sun began painting Manhattan's glass towers gold. I paid cash, walked through the lobby without looking back and took the elevator to my room on the 12th floor. From my window I had a perfect view of our building. Ashton's building now, I supposed. At 6:47 a.m. I ordered room service. Eggs Benedict, fresh fruit, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The normalcy of it felt surreal. At 6:52 I opened my laptop and watched our joint accounts online, knowing the banks would notify Ashton the moment they opened at 7 o'clock. At 7 o'clock exactly I refreshed the page. The accounts showed the automatic divisions Patricia had filed weeks ago, triggered by my official change of residence. $17 million, redistributed according to New York state matrimonial law. Half of everything just as the prenup he'd insisted on had specified. The same prenup he thought protected him but actually guaranteed my rights to marital assets. My phone, placed face up on the white tablecloth, lit up at 7:03. Ashton's photo appeared. The one from our wedding where he looked invincible. I let it ring through to voicemail. By 7:15 he'd called 9 times. I turned on the voice recorder, playing each message aloud to the empty room. First message, Mila, what's happening? The bank just called. There's some kind of error with our accounts. Fourth message, this isn't funny. Call me back. We need to fix this before the markets open. 11th message, what did you do? What did you do? 19th message, please. Whatever you think you're accomplishing, we can work this out. You don't understand the position you're putting me in. 28th message, the margin calls are hitting. I can't cover them without those funds. You're destroying everything we built. 35th message, Mila, please. They're freezing everything. The FBI is here. God, please answer. By noon, his voice had devolved from commanding to begging. The 47th call came through as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. This time I recognized the number. His lawyer, not him. Mrs. Whitmore, this is James Kellerman. Your husband has retained me to discuss the irregular movement of marital assets. We need to. I hung up and blocked the number. Then I called Patricia. They're panicking, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Everything we did was completely legal. Those assets were jointly owned, you had full withdrawal rights, and we followed the letter of the law. He can contest it, but it'll take months, and by then he'll have bigger problems. That evening I was eating dinner in my room, a perfect piece of salmon I could actually taste now that my appetite had returned, when my phone buzzed with a news alert. I turned on the television, flipping to CNN. The footage was beautiful in its brutality. Richard Whitmore, the man who'd built an empire on other people's losses, being led from his Westchester mansion in handcuffs. His silver hair was disheveled, his usual armor of expensive suits replaced with a wrinkled shirt. FBI agents carried boxes of evidence past the cameras, each one containing Margaret's 40 years of patient documentation. Federal authorities arrested hedge fund mogul Richard Whitmore this morning, the reporter announced, following a years-long investigation into insider trading, tax evasion, and wire fraud. Sources indicate multiple whistleblowers provided crucial evidence, including detailed records spanning 4 decades. My phone lit up with a text from Margaret, just a champagne bottle emoji. Margaret, who'd never sent an emoji in her life, who'd served these men coffee while documenting their crimes, had finally seen justice arrive at Richard Whitmore's door. 3 weeks passed in strange peace. I met with FBI agents, provided testimony, watched the news coverage from my hotel room as the empire crumbled in real time. Nathan fled to Switzerland. Graham Chin pled guilty immediately, hoping for leniency. Other partners turned state's evidence, racing to sell each other out for reduced sentences. Then on a Thursday evening Ashton found me. I was sitting at the Ritz-Carlton bar, drinking champagne I'd bought with my own money earned from trades I'd made while he thought I was playing with cute apps. He looked like a ghost wearing an expensive suit. Unshaven, hollow-eyed, his Tom Ford jacket wrinkled like he'd slept in it. You destroyed everything, he said without preamble, standing too close, whiskey on his breath at 6 p.m. I turned on my bar stool, met his bloodshot eyes directly. Oh. I revealed everything. There's a difference. We had a life. You had a life. I had a role in your performance. I took a sip of champagne, letting the bubbles settle before continuing. You said I wouldn't survive a week without you. It's been 21 days and you're the one who looks like he's drowning. He reached for my wrist, his fingers closing on air as I pulled away. You don't understand what you've done. My father's facing 20 years. The fund is gone. Everything is. Everything is exactly what you built it to be, a house of cards. I just stopped holding my breath. His face contorted, anger replacing desperation. He raised his voice, drawing stares from other patrons. You stupid. Sir. The bartender, a woman about Margaret's age, stepped forward. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Do you know who I am? Ashton demanded. Someone who's disturbing our guests, she replied calmly. Security arrived within minutes. 2 men who guided Ashton out with professional efficiency while he shouted about lawyers and lawsuits. The bartender returned to her station, polished a glass, and set another champagne flute in front of me. On the house, she said. That was long overdue. 2 days later, Diana and I were called to testify on the same day, though we'd never coordinated. She looked stronger than I'd ever seen her, no longer the wilting flower at dinner parties. We sat in the courthouse hallway, not speaking but understanding everything. Margaret's testimony came last and lasted 3 days. She brought receipts for everything. Every bribe, every threat, every woman they'd destroyed. She spoke about Elena's accident, Caroline's institutionalization, Jennifer's manufactured bankruptcy. She presented 4 decades of evidence with the precision of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. Why did you keep all of this? The prosecutor asked. Margaret adjusted her glasses, looked directly at Richard where he sat at the defendant's table. Because I knew that someday someone would be brave enough to use it. Someone like Mrs. Hawthorne. The prosecutor looked confused. You mean Mrs. Whitmore? No, Margaret said firmly. I mean Miss Hawthorne. She took back her name. She took back everything. That night Patricia called with news. The prosecutor says Margaret's evidence alone guarantees convictions. Richard will never see freedom again. Ashton's looking at 15 to 20. I stood at my hotel window looking out at the city lights, all those towers that would keep standing long after the Whitmore empire had turned to dust. The towers looked smaller from Patricia's office window, or maybe I was just seeing them differently now. She slid the final divorce decree across her desk, a document that weighed nothing but changed everything. The judge's ruling came through this morning, she said, unable to hide her satisfaction. The house, 60% of remaining liquid assets, plus your separate property remains untouched. The courtroom had been packed 3 days earlier. Ashton sat beside his lawyer, wearing the same suit he'd worn to our wedding, though it hung loose on his frame now. Stress had carved away his golden boy polish, leaving someone I barely recognized. His lawyer, Kellerman, had tried one last desperate play. Mrs. Whitmore benefited from these alleged crimes. She lived in luxury, enjoyed the proceeds. Patricia stood smoothly, pulling out her laptop. Your Honor, I'd like to play a recording from Mr. Whitmore's personal voice recorder, dated 14 months ago. Ashton's voice filled the courtroom, clear and contemptuous. She wouldn't understand a financial statement if I drew her pictures. That's the beauty of marrying someone decorative. She's too stupid to ask complicated questions. Judge Catherine Chin, a woman who'd probably heard every variation of this story, looked directly at Ashton. Mr. Whitmore, it appears you were quite wrong about your wife's intelligence. Perhaps if you'd been less convinced of her stupidity, you might have been more careful with your crimes. Now, holding the decree, I signed my name, Mila Hawthorne, on every line Patricia indicated. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten existed. The whistleblower reward should clear next week, Patricia added. Between yours and Margaret's, you'll have more than enough for your plans. Margaret was waiting in the lobby wearing a new suit, the first time I'd seen her in anything but servant's clothes. We walked 2 blocks to the building where Ashton's fund used to operate. The directory in the lobby still had a blank space where Whitmore Capital Management had been listed. 3rd floor, Margaret said, pressing the elevator button. The landlord gave us a deal. Apparently having a foundation for abuse survivors is better PR than having empty offices. The space was modest, 4 rooms that had once been a dental practice. But the windows faced east, catching morning light, and there was something poetic about building our future above Ashton's ruins. Phoenix Foundation, Margaret read from the temporary sign we'd hung that morning. Rising from ashes. Our first client arrived that afternoon. Jennifer Chin, wife of a pharmaceutical executive who'd been doctoring clinical trial data. She clutched a folder of documents like a life preserver. My husband says I'm paranoid, she whispered, looking between Margaret and me. Says I wouldn't understand the science anyway. Margaret leaned forward, her 40 years of experience compressed into absolute certainty. Every document tells a story, Mrs. Chin. We're going to help you write a new ending. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, my mother called. I'm coming to visit, she announced, not asking. I need to see my daughter. I'd moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, smaller than the penthouse by far, but full of windows and light. The kitchen was cramped but functional, and I'd been teaching myself to actually cook, not just heat things up. Mom arrived with 1 suitcase and 1,000 questions she was too polite to ask. I met her at JFK myself, driving my own used Honda. Reliable, practical, invisible in traffic. You look different, she said, studying my face as we sat in airport traffic. Younger somehow. Lighter. That week we didn't talk about Ashton or the trial or the money sitting in accounts I could access but rarely touched. We talked about the foundation, about Margaret's dry humor, about the women who came to us carrying secrets like stones. I cooked Thanksgiving dinner. Turkey that was slightly dry, stuffing that was perfect, cranberry sauce from a can because some traditions deserve to survive. Mom watched me move around my kitchen, comfortable in my space in a way I'd never been in the penthouse. You're happy, she said, not a question but a revelation. I'm free, I corrected, then reconsidered. Which might be the same thing. She stayed an extra week, sleeping in the guest room I'd painted sage green, reading books while I worked on foundation cases. On her last night she hugged me the way she used to when I was small, before I learned to perform happiness instead of feel it. I'm proud of you, she whispered. Not for surviving him but for becoming yourself. 6 months had passed since I'd walked out of the penthouse. Spring was arriving in Brooklyn, and I stood in the doorway of the house, My house now, though I'd only returned to sign the final papers. The rooms echoed with absence, Ashton's things long since removed by movers his mother hired. My phone rang. Margaret, her voice energized in a way that 40 years of silence never allowed. "We have a new client," she said. "Senator Williams's wife. She's been documenting campaign finance violations for 2 years." I looked at the keys in my hand, the ones I'd taken back, the ones I'd left, the ones I'd earned. They were heavier now, weighted with purpose instead of revenge. Through the window, I could see Madison Hayes walking past with her new fiancé. Not Ashton, who was serving 3 to 5 in minimum security, or any Whitmore man, but someone her own age who held her hand like it mattered. "Ready for round 2? Margaret asked. I thought about the 17 women who'd come through our doors in just 3 months. 4 had successfully left their marriages with their assets intact. 13 were still gathering courage and documentation. Each one learning what I'd learned, that freedom isn't granted, it's taken one document at a time. I was born ready, I told Margaret, closing the door on the empty house. I just didn't know it until someone tried to convince me I was nothing. The lock clicked with finality. I walked to my Honda, tossing the keys to the estate agent who'd sell this monument to Ashton's ego. The proceeds would fund the Phoenix Foundation for another year, maybe 2. As I drove back to Brooklyn, back to my smaller, warmer life, I thought about Elena, Caroline, Jennifer, the ghosts of wives past who'd walked this path before me. They'd been broken or silenced or erased. But their stories, preserved in Margaret's careful documentation, had saved me. Now Margaret and I were saving others, one signature at a time, one woman at a time, building a bridge out of the ashes of the empire we'd burned down. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. "Coffee tomorrow? I have someone you should meet. She needs our help." I smiled, merging into traffic, heading home. My real home, not a cage with a doorman and a marble counter where I'd finally set down my keys and walked toward this moment, this life, this freedom that looked exactly like I'd always imagined it would. Unremarkable, undramatic, and absolutely mine. If this story of calculated revenge had you cheering for Mila, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when she lined up those keys on the granite counter and walked away without looking back. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.